The chains burned cold against Thomas Hartley's wrists, not metal, something worse. Energy restraints that hummed with a frequency just below hearing vibrating through his bones like a tuning fork pressed to his skull. He stood at the center of the Grand Council chamber, a room he had mopped 1,000 times now, seeing it from an angle no human was meant to survive. 12 crystalline figures towered above him in a perfect circle. Their bodies pulsed with angry reds and furious oranges, colors he had learned to read like a soldier reads terrain. 3 years of invisible observation, 3 years of silence, and now every lesson came flooding back in the worst possible context. They were afraid, terrified even. And terrified beings with absolute power made the most dangerous executioners. Admiral Kale stepped forward, his massive form casting prismatic shadows across the obsidian floor. The scars on his crystalline body caught the light, 47 of them. Tom had counted during long nights of cleaning round the Admiral's private quarters. Each one a battle, each one a reminder that this being had survived horrors Tom could only imagine. Kale's voice rang through the chamber like a struck bell, resonant and cold. The charges were read with ceremonial precision. Manipulation of the crown. Sedition against 3 millennia of Valorian civilization. Conspiracy to undermine the natural order of the galaxy. Tom listened to his death sentence being pronounced in a language he was never supposed to understand, delivered by beings who had never once looked at him as anything more than furniture that occasionally moved. The Admiral's final words echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The punishment for such crimes was singular and absolute. Execution. Immediate. Final. No appeal? No mercy, no consideration for the fact that the accused was merely human. A species so far beneath Valorian concern that the council had debated for 20 minutes whether trying him was even worth their time. Tom's eyes found a spot on the floor near his feet. A small imperfection in the obsidian, a tiny scratch he had tried to buff out 6 months ago but never quite managed to eliminate. Strange the details that surface when death stands close enough to touch. He thought about Sarah, about her graduation ceremony. He would never see about the video message he had recorded and deleted because goodbye felt too much like giving up. But the voice that narrated his thoughts in that frozen moment spoke with the clarity of hindsight. 3 years earlier, Thomas Hartley had been nobody, a night guard, a man who cleaned floors and checked locks and made himself invisible because invisibility meant survival. He had not known that a single question asked in darkness would bring him here. He had not known that answering honestly would cost him everything. To understand how a janitor came to stand trial before the mightiest empire the galaxy had ever known, the story had to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the night when Thomas Hartley was still just a ghost, walking among giants. 3 years earlier, the transit pod hummed through the pre-dawn darkness of Manhattan. Tom pressed his forehead against the cool glass and watched the city slide past familiar towers of steel and concrete, now dwarfed by the crystalline spire that rose from where Central Park used to be, the Valorian Council Palace, headquarters for their administration of Earth's Eastern Hemisphere, a monument to humanity's new place in the cosmic order. 32 years since first contact, 30 years since absorption into the Valorian Empire. Tom remembered both dates with the precision of a historian, which was what he had been before the universe decided human expertise in ancient civilizations no longer qualified as useful labor. Professor of military history at Columbia, specialist in the rise and fall of empires, now specialist in making floors shine for beings who would never notice. The irony was not lost on him. Never had been. He clocked in at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes early, because the morning shift supervisor was a Valorian named Crix, who enjoyed finding reasons to dock human workers' pay. Tom held the title of night security on his badge, but the job description had evolved over 3 years into something closer to invisible maintenance. He checked locks, monitored quarters, and cleaned every surface the day staff considered beneath their attention. The Valorians did not distinguish between human roles. Janitor, guard, maintenance worker, all were simply labor class, interchangeable, and forgettable. The supply closet smelled of industrial cleaning solution and something faintly metallic that Tom had never been able to identify. He loaded his cart with the usual equipment, mop bucket sanitizing agents approved for use on Valorian crystalline surfaces, a small toolkit for minor repairs that no one else bothered to handle. His route was fixed, immutable, carved into his muscle memory through 1,000 repetitions. Hallway 7, administrative offices, the smaller council chambers, the grand corridor leading to the main chamber, and finally the grand council chamber itself, where the fate of billions was decided by beings who had never asked those billions for their opinion. Tom pushed his cart down hallway 7 and let his mind wander to safer territory. Sarah had called yesterday excited about her upcoming exams. She was thriving at the Valorian Medical Academy on the orbital station above Geneva, one of only 12 humans admitted to their advanced program in the past decade. His brother's daughter, the last piece of Michael still walking in the world. Michael, who had taken a bullet meant for his squad leader in Basra in 2003. Michael, who had left behind a 3-year-old daughter and a note asking Tom to make sure she had every opportunity he never did. Tom had been mopping floors for that promise ever since. The memory surfaced without warning, as memories of war often did. Kuwait 1991. The smell of burning oil and diesel fuel. The weight of Sergeant Rodriguez over Tom's shoulders as he dragged the wounded man toward the evac point, bullets kicking up sand around them. Rodriguez had outweighed him by 40 pounds. Tom had carried him anyway because that was what you did. You carried your people. You didn't leave them behind. A Valorian officer rounded the corner ahead, moving with the fluid grace that made their kind seem like living sculptures. Tom stepped aside, immediately pressing his back against the wall, making himself as small as possible. The officer didn't slow, didn't acknowledge, simply continued forward as if the hallway were empty. The cart caught the officer's leg. Tom's fault, he had angled it wrong in his haste to clear the path. The Valorian stopped, turned, color shifting from neutral gray to irritated orange. Tom opened his mouth to apologize, but the words never made it out. The blow came fast, a crystalline hand striking his chest with enough force to send him stumbling backward into the wall. Pain blossomed across his ribs. The officer's colors deepened to angry red, and words poured out in the Valorian tongue, harsh, dismissive, laden with contempt for the creature that had dared to obstruct a superior being's path. Tom understood every word. 3 years of listening had burned the language into his brain, syllable by syllable, until comprehension came as naturally as breathing. He understood the insults, the casual cruelty, the absolute certainty that he was less than nothing. He also understood that responding would be suicide. So he bowed his head, mumbled an apology in English, which the officer probably didn't understand and certainly didn't care about. Waited until the crystalline footsteps faded down the corridor before allowing himself to breathe again. His ribs ached. There would be bruises tomorrow. He had hidden worse from Sarah during video calls, angling the camera just right, keeping his sleeves long to cover the marks left by beings who saw him as furniture that occasionally got in the way. The Grand Council chamber was empty when Tom arrived an hour later, as it usually was at this hour. The massive space stretched out before him, all obsidian floors and crystalline walls, and a domed ceiling that seemed to capture starlight even during the day. Beautiful in a way that made humans feel small. That was the point he had realized long ago. Everything about Valorian architecture was designed to remind lesser species of their place. He began his routine. Mop the floors, check for debris, inspect the massive windows that overlooked what remained of Manhattan. The work was meditative, almost peaceful when no one was watching. His body moved through the familiar motions while his mind processed the snippets of conversation he had absorbed over the past week. The Empire was in trouble. 3 sectors threatening to break away Draxus Corvin and Thalor. The council had been meeting in emergency sessions for days, arguments echoing through the chamber long after Tom was supposed to have left. He had lingered in the shadows, invisible as always, listening to debates that would determine the fate of billions. Admiral Kale wanted war. Immediate, overwhelming, brutal. Crush Draxus, first make an example, let the other sectors see what defiance cost. The Admiral's voice carried a weight that silenced opposition, his words backed by centuries of military victories and a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. But there was another voice in those debates, quieter but no less powerful. The Queen was coming. Aurelia, sovereign of the Valorian Empire, ruler of 1,000 worlds, the final authority on all matters of state. She was scheduled to arrive within the week for a personal assessment of the crisis. Tom filed the information away without knowing why. Survival instinct, perhaps. The same instinct that had kept him alive in the desert 30 years ago. The same instinct that had carried him through the first chaotic years after absorption. Information was power even for the powerless, especially for the powerless. He was finishing the eastern section of the floor when he noticed the creature in the corner. Echo. That was what the Valorians called it, though. Whether that was a name or simply a designation, Tom had never been sure. A living security system, biosynthetic, created specifically to guard the most sensitive areas of the palace. It looked like nothing Tom had ever seen, vaguely canine in shape, but composed of shifting shadows and crystalline plates. Eyes that glowed with a deep amber light, a presence that made the air itself feel heavier. The creature was chained to the Malay, as always. Heavy restraints that seemed excessive for something the Valorians described as completely obedient. Tom had seen Echo dozens of times over the years, always in the same position, always ignored by everyone who passed. Another piece of equipment, another tool serving its purpose. But tonight something was different. Echo was looking at him. Not through him the way the Valorians did, at him. Those amber eyes tracked his movements with an intensity that made Tom's skin prickle. He stopped mopping, returned the gaze, and in that moment of connection, he saw something he had never expected to find in a creature designed for security and obedience. Hunger, not the metaphorical kind, actual physical hunger. The Valorians had forgotten to feed it. Tom checked the chamber. Empty. Checked the hallway beyond. Empty. Checked his watch, still 40 minutes until the first administrators arrived. Plenty of time to finish his work and disappear into the background where he belonged. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the protein bar he had packed for his break. Standard issue human rations, nothing special. Probably nothing a biosynthetic creature would even recognize as food. But Echo's eyes followed the motion and something shifted in those amber depths. Interest. Hope. What he did next could get him fired. Possibly worse. Unauthorized contact with Valorian property was a serious offense, and Echo was classified as critical security infrastructure. But Tom remembered the stray dog his unit had adopted in Iraq, a mangy mutt they had named Lucky, who had followed them from base to base until an IED took him along with two of Tom's friends. He remembered how Lucky had looked when they first found him, starving, terrified, forgotten by a world that had moved on without him. Echo looked the same way now. Tom crossed the chamber slowly, keeping his movements calm and predictable. Echo's ears, or what passed for ears, on a creature of shadow and crystal, flattened against its head. A low sound emerged from its throat, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. Warning and plea mixed into a single note of animal uncertainty. Easy, boy. Tom kept his voice low, soothing the same tone he had used with Lucky all those years ago. I'm not gonna hurt you. Just thought you might be hungry. He held out the protein bar. Echo's nostrils flared. Did it even have nostrils? And the creature's body tensed against its chains. For a long moment, nothing happened. Tom waited patient as Stone Arm extended, offering without demanding. Then Echo leaned forward and took the food from his hand with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something designed to kill intruders. The creature ate quickly, desperately, the way only the truly starving ate. When it finished, those amber eyes found Tom's face again, and something had changed in their depths. Recognition, gratitude, the beginning of something that might in time become trust. Tom heard footsteps in the corridor and moved that fast, returning to his mop, putting distance between himself and the chained creature. A guard passed the chamber entrance, glanced inside, saw nothing worth noting, and continued on. Tom's heart pounded against his bruised ribs. He finished his work and left without looking back at Echo. But he felt those amber eyes following him until he rounded the corner and disappeared. The Queen arrived 3 days later. Tom had seen Valorian royalty before administrators, governors, military commanders who visited Earth on inspection tours. They were impressive beings, all towering height and prismatic light confidence, radiating from every crystalline facet. But Aurelia was something different, something more. She stood nearly 12 feet tall, her body composed of crystal that seemed to capture and refract light in ways that defied physics. Where other Valorians displayed colors that shifted with mood: red for anger, orange for stress, blue for contemplation, the Queen's form held a silver-blue luminescence that remained constant, steady, almost hypnotic. A crown of pure energy circled her head like a halo, marking her status with unmistakable clarity. But it wasn't her size or her radiance that caught Tom's attention as he watched from the shadows of the service corridor. It was her colors. Beneath that silver-blue exterior, muted and nearly hidden, he detected something he had never seen in a Valorian before: exhaustion, grief. The weight of centuries pressing down on shoulders that had carried an empire for longer than human civilization had existed. She was tired, deeply, profoundly tired, and she was alone. The council session that followed was unlike anything Tom had witnessed in 3 years. Admiral KL presented his case for immediate military action with the passion of absolute conviction. Sector Draxus had committed unforgivable acts of defiance. Their leaders had rejected imperial authority, seized military installations, declared themselves independent. The only appropriate response was overwhelming force, crush the rebellion quickly, completely, and so thoroughly that no other sector would dare follow their example. The other council members voiced their support in varying degrees. Some eagerly, others reluctantly, but all falling in line behind the Admiral's certainty. War was coming. The only questions were when and how brutal. Tom mopped the floor near the massive windows, invisible as always, and watched the Queen's colors. She listened to Kyle's arguments without interruption, her crystalline face unreadable, that silver-blue glow never wavering. But beneath the surface, Tom could see the subtle shifts that others seemed to miss. Doubt, reluctance, a monarch struggling with a decision that would define her legacy. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of authority that silenced the chamber instantly. She acknowledged the gravity of the situation. She recognized the council's concerns. She would take their recommendations under advisement and render her decision within the week. It was not the immediate endorsement of war that KL had expected. The Admiral's colors flashed with frustration before he brought them under control. Other council members exchanged glances that spoke of uncertainty, of factions realigning, of calculations being revised. Tom continued mopping, continued watching, continued learning. That night he returned to the Grand Council chamber during his regular shift. The space was empty as expected, lit only by the ambient glow of the crystalline walls and the city lights streaming through the massive windows. He began his routine floors, windows a quick check of the smaller meeting rooms that branched off the main chamber. Echo was waiting for him. The creature had pressed itself as close to the edge of its chains as the restraints would allow, amber eyes fixed on the entrance where Tom appeared. A low sound emerged from its throat, not the warning tone of their first encounter, but something softer. Something almost like welcome. Tom had brought 2 protein bars tonight. He crossed the chamber and offered the first one, and Echo took it with that same surprising gentleness. The creature ate more slowly this time, savoring instead of desperately consuming, and when it finished, it made a sound that Tom could only interpret as contentment. He was reaching for the second bar when he heard it, the whisper of crystalline footsteps in the corridor beyond. Someone was coming. Tom moved fast, but not fast enough. He made it halfway back to his cart before the chamber entrance darkened with a familiar silhouette. Admiral KL, in all his scarred and imposing glory, stood framed in the doorway. The Admiral's colors shifted to suspicious orange. His eyes moved from Tom to Echo to Tom, again calculating, assessing, drawing conclusions that would not favor the human. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then KL stepped forward, his massive form seeming to fill the entire space. He addressed Tom in Valorian, the words clipped and cold, a command more than a question. "What are you doing here, human?" Tom kept his expression neutral, pretended not to understand, gestured vaguely toward his mop and bucket, toward the floors that needed cleaning, toward the work that had been assigned to him. Just a janitor doing his job, nothing more. KL was not convinced. The Admiral moved closer, close enough that Tom could see the individual cracks and fractures in his crystalline body, the history of violence written in wounds that had never fully healed. When he spoke again, it was in heavily accented English, a concession to Tom's presumed ignorance that somehow felt more threatening than the Valorian had. The creature does not respond to your kind. It was designed to ignore lesser species entirely. Yet I have received reports that it follows your movements, that it makes sounds when you are near. Explain this. Tom's mind raced through possible responses, discarding each one as quickly as it formed. Denial would be pointless. KO clearly had evidence of something unusual. Confession would be dangerous. Admitting to unauthorized interaction with security infrastructure could end his career, possibly his life. He chose a middle path. The creature seemed hungry, Admiral. I offered it food, that is all. Kale's colors deepened to something between orange and red, suspicion and anger warring for dominance. The Admiral leaned closer, and Tom caught a scent like ozone and ancient stone, the smell of a being who had lived through more battles than Tom could count. You understand more than you pretend, human. I have watched your kind for centuries. You are cunning in your weakness, adaptive in your subservience. But do not mistake our tolerance for blindness. Whatever you are doing with that creature, it ends now. The Admiral straightened, turned, and swept out of the chamber without another word. Tom stood frozen, heart hammering, until his crystalline footsteps faded into silence. Echo made a small sound from its corner. When Tom looked, those amber eyes held something that might have been sympathy, or warning, or both. He finished his shift without incident and went home to his small apartment in the human quarter. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it finally did, he dreamed of chains and trials and verdicts delivered by beings made of light. The summons arrived 2 days later. Thomas Hartley was to report to the Administrative Oversight Office at 0900 hours to address concerns regarding his conduct during work assignments. The language was bureaucratic, almost gentle, but Tom recognized it for what it was. He was being fired, or worse. The Oversight Office occupied a small section of the palace's lower levels, a space designed for dealing with human workers who had failed to meet Valorian standards. Tom had passed it hundreds of times without ever entering. Now he stood before its entrance, straightening his uniform, preparing himself for whatever judgment awaited inside. The administrator was a mid-level Valorian named Sethis, his crystalline body displaying the board green of routine paperwork. He reviewed Tom's file on a holographic display, asked perfunctory questions about length of service and work history, and finally arrived at the matter at hand. Unauthorized contact with designated security apparatus, potential contamination of biological programming. Recommended action, immediate termination of employment and deportation to labor assignment in the outer territories. Tom's heart sank. Deportation meant separation from Sarah, from his life, from everything he had built in his years of invisible service. It meant abandoning the promise he had made to Michael, and the promise that had kept him going through every humiliation and hardship. He was preparing to accept his fate. What choice did he have when the door to the Oversight Office opened? Queen Aurelia entered. The effect was immediate and absolute. Sethis scrambled to his feet, his colors shifting to respectful purple, his earlier boredom replaced by wide-eyed reverence. Even Tom felt the weight of her presence, the way the air itself seemed to bend around her like light around a star. The Queen's eyes found Tom's face, held. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she simply looked at him, not through him, not past him, but at him, seeing him in a way that no Valorian had ever bothered to attempt. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the same quiet authority that had silenced the council chamber days earlier. She had reviewed the reports regarding this human. She found them interesting. The matter of unauthorized contact would be addressed personally under her direct supervision. The administrator was dismissed. Sethis departed with barely concealed confusion, leaving Tom alone with the most powerful being in the known galaxy. The Queen moved closer, her crystalline form catching the office's dim light and transforming it into something almost warm. When she spoke again, it was in the Valorian tongue, a test Tom realized instantly, a probe to determine what he truly understood. You have been cleaning our halls for 3 years, human, moving among us like a shadow. And yet you are not invisible, not entirely. The creature called Echo has watched for predators since before your species discovered fire. It trusts nothing, fears everything, and yet it follows you with its eyes. It makes sounds of welcome when you approach. Tom made a decision. The same kind of decision he had made in that desert 30 years ago, when carrying his wounded sergeant towards safety meant exposing himself to enemy fire. Sometimes survival meant risk. Sometimes the only way forward was through. He answered in Valorian, "Yes, Your Majesty, I understand your language. I have learned it over 3 years of listening. And yes, I fed the creature. It was hungry. No one else seemed to notice." The Queen's colors flickered surprise, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. She had not expected confession. She had not expected a human to speak her tongue with such facility. For a moment, something almost like respect crossed her ancient features. She asked him then about his past, his history, his species' endless cycles of conflict and reconciliation. She asked about Earth's empires, how they rose, how they fell, how some managed to endure while others crumbled to dust. And Tom answered, drawing on decades of scholarship and a lifetime of observation, translating complex ideas into terms a being from a completely different civilization might understand. He told her about Rome, which had conquered and been conquered, in turn adapting its enemies' strengths until Roman civilization became something far greater than any single people could have built alone. He told her about the British Empire, which had tried to rule through force and found that force alone could never hold an empire together. He told her about America, his own country, which had taken a different path after its greatest war. We had a plan after World War II, the Marshall Plan. Our enemies, Germany, Japan, had been devastated, ruined. We could have punished them, occupied them forever, kept them weak and dependent. Instead, we helped them rebuild, invested in their recovery, turned enemies into allies and allies into partners. The Queen's colors shifted to deep blue, contemplation, interest. She asked why. Why would the victors strengthen the vanquished? What possible advantage could come from such apparent weakness? Tom's answer came from somewhere deeper than scholarship. It came from the desert, from the weight of his sergeant over his shoulders, from the promise he had made to a dying brother about a little girl who deserved better than the world was prepared to give her. Because enemies you crush just wait for the chance to rise again. But enemies you help become something else entirely. They become invested in the same system you are building. They become partners in peace because peace serves their interests too. The tighter you hold, the more they fight to break free. But if you hold loosely, if you give them reasons to stay, they choose to remain. The silence that followed was different from the silences Tom had experienced with other Valorians. This was not the silence of dismissal or contempt. This was the silence of a being genuinely considering what she had heard. Finally, the Queen asked one last question, the question that would change everything. If you were in my position, human-facing sectors that threatened to tear the Empire apart, what would you do with Sector Draxus? Tom thought about Admiral Kael's scars, about the Council's fears, about billions of lives hanging in the balance of a decision that was not his to make. He thought about saying nothing, about retreating into the safety of invisibility, about letting beings far more powerful than himself determine the galaxy's fate. But he also thought about Echo, chained in a corner, forgotten and starving, until a janitor with nothing to lose decided that even a creature designed for violence deserved kindness. He thought about the weight of empires, the patterns of history, the lessons written in blood across 10,000 years of human civilization. He answered honestly because honesty was all he had left to give. I would talk to them. Not as a ruler issuing commands, but as someone who genuinely wants to understand what they need. I would ask questions instead of making demands. I would find out what would make them want to stay instead of assuming I know what's best for them. The Queen said nothing. Her colors cycled through shades Tom had never seen before. Consideration, uncertainty, something that might have been hope. Then without another word, she turned and swept out of the office, leaving him alone with the weight of what had just transpired. Tom stood there for a long time, staring at the door through which the most powerful being in the galaxy had just exited. He thought about the questions she had asked, the answers he had given, the dangerous territory he had wandered into without fully understanding the risks. He thought about Echo still chained in the Grand Council chamber, still waiting for someone to notice that even creatures designed for obedience needed to be fed. And he thought about Sarah studying medicine among the stars, building a future that depended on her uncle keeping his head down and staying invisible. But invisibility was no longer an option. The Queen had seen him, really seen him. And whatever happened next, whatever consequences flowed from this moment of honesty, there was no going back to the shadow life he had built. Tom returned to his cart, picked up his mop, and went back to work. Floors still needed cleaning. Hallways still needed checking. The routine of survival continued even as something fundamental shifted beneath its surface. Later that night, when he entered the Grand Council chamber for his regular shift, Echo was waiting. The creature's amber eyes tracked his approach. And for the first time, Echo made a sound that was unmistakably joyful. A greeting, a welcome, the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. Tom sat down beside the chained creature and shared his dinner. Outside the massive windows, the city lights of New York glittered against the darkness. Human and Valorian architecture merged into a skyline that belonged to neither species entirely. Somewhere up there beyond the atmosphere, beyond the orbital stations, and the jump points, in the vast reaches of imperial space, decisions were being made that would determine whether billions lived or died. And here in the heart of it all, a janitor and a creature made of shadows sat together in comfortable silence, two forgotten beings finding in each other something the mighty had overlooked, the value of simply being seen. The nights that followed carried a rhythm Tom had never expected to find in the heart of an alien empire. He would finish his regular duties, floors mopped, corridors checked, the invisible labor that kept the palace functioning, and then he would make his way to the Queen's private study, where conversations stretched until the first light of dawn began to color the Manhattan skyline. Aurelia asked questions no Valorian had ever asked him, not about human labor capacity or biological limitations, or the proper protocols for managing a subjugated species. She asked about war, about peace, about the strange alchemy that transformed enemies into allies and allies into something more. And Tom answered with everything he had learned in a lifetime of studying civilizations that had risen and fallen, long before humanity ever looked up at the stars. Echo came with him, now unchained by the Queen's personal order, padding silently through the crystalline corridors like a shadow-given form. The creature had imprinted on Tom in ways that defied its original programming, following him with a devotion that seemed to unsettle every Valorian they passed. Guards who had once ignored Tom completely now watched him with wary attention, their colors shifting to suspicious oranges whenever Echo's amber eyes swept across them. The Queen noticed everything but said nothing about the creature's presence. She seemed to find something meaningful in the bond that had formed between a human janitor and a biosynthetic predator designed to trust no one. Perhaps it confirmed something she had begun to suspect about the nature of connection, about the possibility that loyalty could be earned rather than programmed. Their conversations ranged across centuries and civilizations. Tom told her about Alexander the Great, who had conquered the known world by his early 30s and watched his empire fracture the moment his hand was no longer there to hold it together. He told her about Genghis Khan, whose brutality had forged the largest contiguous empire in human history, but whose legacy had dissolved into warring factions within generations. He told her about the Ottoman Empire, which had endured for 6 centuries by allowing conquered peoples to maintain their own religions, their own laws, their own identities within the larger imperial framework. The pattern emerged through repetition, example after example, reinforcing the same fundamental truth. Empires built on force alone required ever-increasing force to maintain. They exhausted themselves, crushing rebellion after rebellion, each suppression breeding the seeds of the next uprising. But empires that found ways to make membership valuable, that offered something people wanted to be part of, rather than something they were forced to accept, those empires could endure. In every war I ever studied, Tom said one night, the winner wasn't the side with the most weapons or the biggest army. The winner was the side that understood what the other side actually needed. You can't defeat an enemy you don't understand, and you can't build peace with people you have never bothered to listen to. The Queen's colors shifted through shades of contemplation that Tom had learned to recognize. She was processing, integrating, testing his ideas against 3 centuries of her own experience. Sometimes she pushed back, citing examples from Valorian history where mercy had been repaid with betrayal. Sometimes she simply listened, her ancient eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him feel simultaneously exposed and respected. She told him about her husband, lost in a civil war over 100 years ago. The memory still carried weight in her voice, a grief that time had softened but never erased. She had ruled alone since then, carrying the burden of an empire that stretched across 1,000 worlds, making decisions that affected billions of lives without anyone to share the weight. Tom recognized that particular kind of loneliness. He had felt it himself in the years after Michael's death, when the responsibility for Sarah had fallen entirely on his shoulders. The isolation of being the one who had to decide, who had to act, who had to carry consequences that no one else could fully understand. They were not friends. The gulf between a human janitor and a galactic monarch was too vast for such simple categorization. But they had become something, allies perhaps, or students of each other, learning lessons that neither could have found alone. Sarah called during his 3rd week of midnight conversations, her face filling his small communication screen with worried eyes and a tension she was trying unsuccessfully to hide. The connection from the orbital station was clear enough that Tom could see the stress lines forming around her mouth the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her uniform. Uncle Tom, there are rumors. People are talking about a human who's been meeting with the Queen. They're saying he's manipulating her, poisoning her mind with primitive ideas. She paused, searching his face for something she seemed afraid to find. It's not you, is it? Tom had never lied to Sarah. Not when she asked about her father's death. Not when she asked why humans had to work so hard for so little. Not when she asked whether the universe would ever be fair. He had always given her truth, even when truth was painful, because he believed she deserved better than comfortable deceptions. But looking at her worried face, he found himself calculating the cost of honesty for the first time in their relationship. If he confirmed the rumors, she would be implicated. The niece of a traitor studying among the very beings her uncle had supposedly corrupted. Her career, her future, everything they had sacrificed for all of it could vanish in the time it took for suspicion to become certainty. I'm just doing my job, sweetheart. You know how rumors spread in places like this? Someone sees something they don't understand, and suddenly it's a conspiracy. Sarah's eyes held his through the screen, and Tom saw something shift in their depths. Not belief, recognition. She knew he was lying, and she was choosing not to press because she understood what pressing would cost them both. Just be careful, Uncle Tom. Please, I can't lose you too. The call ended with promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Tom sat in his small apartment and stared at the blank screen for a long time, thinking about the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. The invisible man was stepping into light, and light cast shadows that could swallow everything he loved. Admiral Cale's surveillance intensified as the days passed. Tom spotted the Watchers, now guards, positioned at odd angles, administrative staff, who appeared in corridors. They had no reason to occupy crystalline eyes tracking his movements with poorly concealed interest. The Admiral was building a case, gathering evidence, preparing for a confrontation that grew more inevitable with each secret meeting. Tom reported his observations to the Queen during their nightly conversations. She acknowledged them with the calm of someone who had spent centuries navigating political treachery, adjusting their meeting locations, varying their timing, taking precautions that felt increasingly inadequate against an opponent as experienced as Kyle. But she refused to stop. The conversations had become something essential to her, a lifeline to perspectives she had never encountered in her insulated existence. And the decisions she was making based on those conversations were beginning to reshape the Empire itself. The announcement came on a morning that seemed no different from any other. Tom was cleaning the administrative corridors when the palace communication systems activated, simultaneously broadcasting the Queen's voice to every corner of the facility. He stopped his work and listened, heart-pounding, as Aurelia declared the Valorian Reformation. Sector Tholor, the smallest of the three rebellious territories, would receive a charter of autonomy, self-governance over internal affairs, representation in a reformed advisory council, the freedom to maintain their own cultural practices and local traditions while remaining part of the larger imperial structure. It was everything Tom had suggested translated into the formal language of Valorian governance. A first step toward the kind of federation he had described, the kind of empire that people might choose to belong to rather than being forced to accept. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Tom made his way to the Grand Council chamber as quickly as his invisible status allowed, arriving just as the emergency session began. The space that he had cleaned 1,000 times now pulsed with angry reds and furious oranges, 12 crystalline figures surrounding the Queen like predators circling wounded prey. Admiral Kyle led the assault. His voice carried through the chamber with the force of centuries of military command, each word a weapon aimed at the foundations of what the Queen had announced. And this was madness. Capitulation. The beginning of the end for everything their civilization had built across 3 millennia of expansion and dominance. Other council members added their voices to the chorus of condemnation. Autonomy for one sector would mean demands from every sector. The empire would fragment into 1,000 competing interests, each pulling in different directions, until nothing remained but chaos and collapse. History was clear on this point. Strength held civilizations together, and anything less than strength was an invitation to destruction. The Queen stood at the head of the great table, her silver-blue light steady against the storm of opposition. She had anticipated this resistance, prepared arguments and evidence to support her position. But Tom could see the strain beneath her composure, the weight of standing alone against the unified fury of her own counsel. Then Cale's eyes found Tom. The Admiral had positioned himself perfectly, Tom realized. The emergency session, the concentrated outrage, the moment of maximum vulnerability, all of it had been orchestrated to create this exact opportunity. Cale raised one crystalline arm and pointed directly at the corner where Tom stood with his mop and bucket suddenly visible in a way that made his skin crawl. There! The Admiral's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. There is the source of this corruption. A human, a janitor, a creature so far beneath our notice that we never thought to watch what it was doing in our midst. But I have watched, I have documented, and I have proof that this primitive has been meeting secretly with our queen, filling her mind with the failed philosophies of a conquered species. Every eye in the chamber turned toward Tom. Crystalline faces that had looked through him for 3 years now looked at him with expressions ranging from disgust to curiosity to murderous intent. He felt naked, exposed, stripped of the invisibility that had been his only protection. Guards moved before he could react. Strong, crystalline hands seized his arms, forcing him to his knees on the obsidian floor he had polished so many times. The energy restraints activated around his wrists, the same cold burn he would remember in the trial that was yet to come. Echo's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The creature lunged toward the guards with a speed that seemed impossible for something of its size, amber eyes blazing, a sound emerging from its throat that was part roar and part scream. For a moment, Tom thought the creature might actually reach him, might tear through the guards and free him, through sheer savage determination. But more guards appeared surrounding Echo with weapons drawn, and the creature was forced back, restrained, chained once more to the wall where it had spent so many lonely years before Tom had offered it a protein bar and changed everything. Cale approached Tom slowly, savoring the moment. The Admiral's scarred, crystalline body loomed over the kneeling human colors, shifting through shades of satisfaction that bordered on pleasure. When he spoke, his voice was pitched low enough that only Tom could hear. You will die human, that much is certain. But before you die, I want you to understand why this is happening. I want you to see the truth that your queen refuses to acknowledge. Come, let me show you what mercy costs. They took Tom to a cell deep in the palace's lower levels, not the administrative detention area where minor infractions were processed, but something older, darker, a space that spoke of secrets kept and truths buried. The guards deposited him roughly and departed without a word, leaving him alone in a chamber lit only by the faint glow of crystalline walls. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time lost meaning in the unchanging dimness. Tom sat on the cold floor and tried not to think about Sarah, about the call she would receive when her uncle failed to check in about the future that was crumbling around both of them. He had known the risks, had calculated them carefully, or so he thought. But calculations meant nothing when you were alone in the dark waiting to die. The door opened without warning, and Admiral Cale entered alone. The Admiral's colors had shifted from the satisfied oranges of victory to something deeper, more complex. Blues and purples mixed with undercurrents of gray, a palette Tom had never seen on a Valorian face. Contemplation, memory, pain. Cale settled onto the floor across from Tom, folding his massive crystalline body into a position that seemed almost casual. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the commanding fury from the council chamber. This was something private, something personal, something that had been waiting decades for an audience. 83 years ago, I had a son. The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and heavy with implications Tom was only beginning to grasp. His name was Veleth. He was young by our standards, barely 2 centuries old, but he had already shown promise as a diplomat. He believed, as you seem to believe, that understanding could bridge the gaps between species, that communication could solve problems force could not. Cale's colors deepened, the blue-blues, darkening towards something that looked almost like grief. Sector Draxus was restless even then. Their leaders made demands, issued threats, tested our resolve. The council wanted war. I wanted war. But Veleth convinced the queen, not this queen, her predecessor, to try negotiation instead, to show mercy, to demonstrate that the empire could be reasoned with. Tom listened without speaking, sensing that interruption would shatter whatever fragile impulse had brought the Admiral here. The negotiations succeeded. Draxus received concessions. Their leaders were pardoned for their defiance. Everyone celebrated the triumph of diplomacy over violence. Kale's voice hardened. And then 1 year later, the very rebel we had pardoned the man whose life my son had personally argued to spare, kidnapped Veleth from a diplomatic vessel, and executed him publicly as a message to the Empire. The silence that followed was absolute. Tom saw now the source of the Admiral's fury, the wound that had never healed beneath those 47 battle scars. This was not abstract ideology or political calculation. This was a father who had lost his child to the very principles Tom had been advocating. Mercy killed my son. Kale's words were barely above a whisper. Kindness murdered him. Every time your queen speaks of understanding and negotiation, I hear Veleth's voice. I see his face. And I know with absolute certainty that the same thing will happen again if we allow this madness to continue. Tom understood now why he had been brought here. Not for torture, not for interrogation, but for this, a confession from a being who needed someone to hear the truth behind his hatred. The Admiral wanted Tom to understand, wanted him to see that the opposition to reform came not from cruelty, but from grief, from the desperate need to prevent another father from feeling what KL had felt. And in that understanding, Tom found something he had not expected. Sympathy, not agreement, not surrender, but genuine compassion for a being whose pain had calcified into something monstrous. I know loss too, Admiral. Kael's eyes sharpened colors, flickering with surprise. My brother Michael died in Iraq in 2003, killed by an IED planted by insurgents we had failed to catch the week before. A commanding officer had made a call, released some detainees who seemed harmless, who swore they were just farmers caught in the wrong place. One of those farmers built the bomb that killed Michael. Tom met the Admiral's gaze steadily, forcing himself to hold nothing back. I spent years hating that commanding officer, hating the detainees, hating an entire country for taking my brother away. But hatred didn't bring Michael back. It just hollowed me out, turned me into someone he wouldn't have recognized, someone he wouldn't have been proud to call his brother. And so you forgave them, KL's voice dripped with contempt. You accepted your brother's death as an acceptable cost of mercy, Num. I never forgave, but I stopped letting my grief choose my actions. I stopped letting pain make me into a monster. Tom leaned forward, chains rattling against the cold floor. Your son believed in understanding. He died for that belief, and I can't imagine anything more terrible than losing a child to the very principles they championed. But if you destroy Draxus, if you burn their worlds and murder their children, you won't be honoring Veleth's memory. You'll be becoming the very thing he fought against. Kael's colors flared with anger, but beneath the red, Tom saw something else. Uncertainty. Doubt. The first cracks in a wall of conviction that had stood for 83 years. You are weak. The Admiral's voice trembled slightly. Your species is weak. You accept defeat and call it wisdom. No, I refuse to let pain transform me into a weapon. There's a difference. The silence stretched between them, two beings separated by biology and culture, and centuries of experience connected only by the universal language of grief. Tom did not know what would happen next, whether his words had found purchase or simply bounced off armor too thick to penetrate. But he had spoken truth, and truth was all he had ever been able to offer. Coyle rose without another word and departed. The cell door sealed behind him, leaving Tom alone, with echoes of a conversation that had changed nothing and everything. The trial began 3 days later. They brought Tom to the Grand Council chamber in chains, the same chains that had featured in the cold open of his story the moment he had glimpsed before, understanding how he would arrive there. The massive space was filled now, not just the council, but observers, administrators, military officers, a gallery of crystalline beings who had come to witness the judgment of a human who had dared to advise their queen. Echo was there too, chained heavily in a corner, amber eyes tracking Tom's every movement with a desperation that hurt to witness. The creature strained against its restraints as Tom was positioned at the center of the chamber, and the low sounds it made carried clearly through the perfect acoustics. Admiral Kael served as prosecutor, his scarred form commanding the attention of everyone present. He read the charges with ceremonial precision, manipulation of the crown sedition, against the Empire conspiracy to undermine 3 millennia of Valorian civilization. Each accusation landed like a physical blow, building toward a verdict that seemed inevitable. The evidence was presented methodically. Records of Tom's meetings with the Queen, transcripts of their conversations captured by surveillance systems he had never detected, analysis showing the correlation between his advice and her subsequent policy decisions. A case built with the thoroughness of someone who had been preparing for this moment since the first time he spotted Tom feeding a starving creature in the darkness. Council members added their voices to the condemnation. The human had exploited the Queen's isolation, had preyed upon her grief over her lost husband, had filled her mind with primitive philosophies designed to weaken the empire from within. This was not advice, it was infiltration, subversion, an act of war conducted through whispers instead of weapons. Tom listened to it all and thought about Sarah, about the promise he had made to Michael, about the life he had tried to build in the shadows of beings who had never seen him as anything worth noticing. He thought about Echo straining against chains loyal to him in a way that defied programming and expectation. He thought about the Queen standing silent at the head of the chamber, her colors carefully neutral, as her own council demanded the execution of someone who had become something close to a friend. Admiral Kale finished his presentation and turned to face Tom directly. The chamber fell silent, every crystalline face turned toward the small human figure at its center, waiting for whatever final words the condemned might offer. Tom found his voice. "I am a night guard. I clean the floors where you stand. For 3 years I moved through your halls like a ghost, invisible to everyone hearing everything. You talked about war and peace, about billions of lives, about the fate of entire civilizations, and none of you ever noticed that a human was listening." His words echoed through the chambers, perfect acoustics carrying to every observer, every council member, every being who had come to witness his judgment. But I am also something else. I am a soldier who has seen war, who has smelled blood and heard the screams of children who lost their parents to violence they never understood. I know what conflict costs, not in abstract numbers or strategic calculations, but in faces and names and lives that can never be recovered. Tom met Admiral Kale's eyes without flinching. The Queen asked me a question. She asked what I would do if I faced sectors threatening to break away. And I told her the truth, the same truth I would tell anyone who asked. The same truth that history has demonstrated across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations. Force alone cannot hold an empire together. Fear breeds resistance. Control breeds rebellion. The only sustainable power is power that people choose to accept. His voice grew stronger, fed by something deeper than fear. If speaking that truth is sedition, then your empire is already dead. It just doesn't know it yet. If honesty to a monarch who asked for honesty is a crime worthy of execution, then you have proven everything I said. You rule through fear, and fear only works until someone is more afraid of staying than of fighting. The silence that followed was absolute. Council members exchanged glances, their colors flickering with uncertainty. This was not the groveling confession they had expected, not the desperate pleading of a creature facing death. This was something else entirely, a challenge, issued from the lowest position imaginable. Admiral Kale stepped forward, his colors blazing with fury. Enough. The human has condemned himself with his own words. I call for immediate execution. The response from the council was immediate and nearly unanimous. Voices rose in support of the admiral's demand. Crystalline hands raised in affirmation, a tide of vengeance that seemed impossible to stem. Then the Queen spoke. I invoke the crown's prerogative. 5 words that silenced the chamber more effectively than any weapon. Aurelia's silver-blue light blazed suddenly brighter, her form seeming to grow as ancient authority flowed through her crystalline body. The crown's prerogative, the absolute right of the monarch to override any council decision used perhaps a dozen times in 3,000 years of Valorian history. This human spoke truth when asked for truth. He offered wisdom when wisdom was sought. If that is a crime, then I am equally guilty, for I asked the questions that prompted his answers. The prerogative is invoked. The charges are dismissed. The prisoner is released. The council erupted in outrage. Colors flashed through every shade of red and orange, voices overlapping in a chaos of protest and accusation. But the prerogative was absolute. Even Kale could not argue against 3 millennia of constitutional tradition. The Admiral's colors shifted to something Tom had never seen before. Cold determination mixed with calculated resolve, a predator recognizing that the direct approach had failed and adjusting strategy accordingly. Then you have proven yourself unfit to rule. Kael's words cut through the chaos like a blade silencing every other voice in the chamber. You place the counsel of a primitive above the wisdom of your own counsel. You invoke ancient rights to protect a creature that has manipulated you into betraying everything this empire represents. If this is the judgment of our queen, then our queen has abandoned her duty to her people. The implication was clear. Not just disagreement, but challenge. Not just opposition, but the first step towards something that had not occurred in Valorian history for over 1,000 years. Civil war. The days that followed carried the weight of approaching catastrophe. Sectors Draxus and Corvin, emboldened by the chaos they witnessed in the imperial capital, declared complete independence. Not the autonomy the Queen had offered, but full separation from the Valorian structure entirely. They seized military installations, formed their own alliance, and began preparing for the war they knew was coming. Admiral Kael consolidated his support within the council building, a coalition of members who shared his conviction that force was the only answer. The fleet mobilized warships, repositioning for an assault that would make the previous 3,000 years of imperial violence look like peaceful negotiation. Tom found himself in an impossible position, free by the Queen's decree, but trapped by circumstances beyond anyone's control. He returned to his duties. What else could he do? But the palace had changed around him. Guards who had once ignored him now watched with open hostility. Administrative staff who had processed his paperwork for years refused to meet his eyes. He had become visible in the worst possible way, a symbol of everything the traditionalists despised. Echo stayed close, the creature's presence a comfort and a warning. The bond between them had only deepened through the ordeal of the trial, but that bond made Tom more conspicuous, not less. Everywhere he went, amber eyes followed, and everywhere amber eyes went, crystalline eyes followed in turn. The Queen summoned him one night to her private chambers, bypassing the study where they had held their earlier conversations. The space was smaller, more intimate, filled with personal artifacts that spoke of 4 centuries of leadership and loss. Aurelia stood by a window overlooking the transformed Manhattan skyline, her colors dimmer than Tom had ever seen them. They are going to destroy everything. Her voice carried exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Kael has the counsel. The military follows him. When the attack on Draxus begins, it will not end there. It will spread and spread until the entire empire is consumed by war. And when the fire finally burns out, there will be nothing left but ashes and the beings strong enough to survive them. Tom stood in the doorway, uncertain whether he was welcome to enter further. The distance between them felt vast, unbridgeable, despite everything they had shared. What can I do? The question felt inadequate, a janitor offering to help a queen prevent galactic catastrophe. But it was all he had. Aurelia turned from the window, and Tom saw something in her eyes that he recognized. The same look he had seen in his own reflection during the worst days after Michael's death. The moment when every path forward seemed to lead toward destruction, and the only choice left was which destruction to accept. I am going to Draxus, personally. Without guards, without fleet support, without any of the trappings of imperial power. I am going to speak with their leaders directly and try to find a path that doesn't end in mutual annihilation. Tom's heart clenched. That's suicide. Perhaps, but doing nothing guarantees billions will die. This way there is at least a chance. She moved closer, her silver blue light casting strange shadows across the artifacts of her reign. I want you to come with me. Not as an advisor or a diplomat, but as proof that I am sincere. A human, a member of a species we conquered and subjugated, standing beside me as an equal. It will mean something to them. It will show that I am truly willing to change. The request struck Tom with the force of revelation. Everything he had built, everything he had protected his invisible life, his careful routines, his promise to Sarah, all of it would be risked on a mission that was almost certainly doomed to fail. But he also saw the Queen's face, the desperate hope beneath the exhaustion, the recognition that she was asking for something she had no right to demand. She was not commanding him. She was asking. And somehow that made refusal impossible. When do we leave before dawn? Before Kael realizes what we're planning. Before anyone can stop us. Tom nodded, accepting a fate he could not fully comprehend. Somewhere in the palace, Echo stirred, sensing through their bond that something fundamental was about to change. The escape was chaos and shadow and desperate improvisation. Tom and the Queen moved through service corridors he had cleaned 1,000 times, following routes only the invisible would know. Echo ranged ahead of them, the creature's senses detecting guards and patrols before they could stumble into discovery. They almost made it. The hangar bay stretched before them, a small diplomatic vessel, waiting with engines warm, and a pilot who owed the Queen her life. Freedom was 50 yards away, then 40, then 30. Then the lights blazed on, and Admiral Cale's voice echoed through the cavernous space. Guards materialized from every direction. Weapons drawn, escape routes blocked. Tom felt his heart sink as the Admiral stepped forward, his scarred, crystalline body positioned between the Queen and her only chance of reaching Draxus before war consumed everything. Did you truly think I would not anticipate this? Aurelia Cale's use of her name without title, without deference, was itself a declaration. The relationship between sovereign and subject had been severed. What remained was only the raw calculus of power. Echo attacked without warning, a blur of shadow and crystal launching itself at the guards blocking Tom's path. The creature fought with a ferocity that seemed impossible for something that had spent years chained and forgotten, taking down 2 guards before the others could react. The Queen moved in the same instant, her crystalline form blazing with sudden light, ancient powers activating that Tom had never seen her use. Energy crackled through the hangar, disrupting targeting systems, creating chaos that bought them seconds. Tom ran. There was nothing else to do, nothing else he could contribute to a battle between beings far beyond his physical capabilities. He ran toward the ship, toward the pilot who was already initiating launch sequences, toward the slim chance that somehow they might still escape. Echo fought through guards that should have been able to destroy it easily, taking wounds that would have killed anything natural, refusing to fall, because falling meant failing the human who had shown it kindness when kindness had been forgotten. The Queen reached the ship's ramp just as Tom did, her light flickering from the effort of whatever power she had unleashed. Behind them, Echo finally went down under a wave of crystalline bodies, amber eyes finding Tom's face one last time before the creature disappeared beneath the assault. The ship launched into the pre-dawn sky, leaving behind a hangar full of chaos and a creature that had given everything for a bond forged in darkness and protein bars. Tom pressed his face against the viewport and watched the palace shrink below them. His chest ached with loss. He did not have time to process grief for a companion he might never see again. Beside him, the Queen's colors cycled through exhaustion and relief and something that might have been hope. But in the palace they had left behind, Admiral Kael stood among his guards and smiled for the first time in decades. The Queen had fled, had abandoned her post in the face of crisis, had proven everything he had said about her unfitness to rule. He activated the communication systems with a single thought and broadcast his voice across every channel, every station, every corner of the Valorian Empire. Citizens of the Empire, your Queen has abandoned you. In this moment of crisis, she has fled with a human manipulator, leaving her people to face the consequences of her weakness. As the highest-ranking military officer, I hereby assume regency until such time as proper leadership can be restored. The attack on Draxus will proceed as planned. Then he issued one final order, speaking directly to agents positioned at the orbital station above Geneva. The human has a niece, Sarah Hartley. She is to be taken into protective custody immediately. If the Queen does not return within 72 hours, the girl dies. The transmission ended. In a small ship hurtling toward hostile space, Tom did not yet know that everything he had left behind to protect was already in the hands of his enemies. But he would learn soon enough. And then he would have to choose between the woman he had promised to help and the girl he had promised to protect. The journey to Draxus took 4 days through the vast emptiness between stars. 4 days of silence broken only by the hum of engines and the weight of everything they had left behind. Tom sat in the small observation deck of the diplomatic vessel watching unfamiliar constellations drift past, thinking about a creature with amber eyes who had given everything so that he could be here. The Queen joined him during the second night, her crystalline form settling into the seat beside his with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Her colors had stabilized since their escape, the frantic energy of flight giving way to something more measured, more determined. But beneath the calm surface, Tom could still see the flickers of doubt that plagued even the most powerful beings when they gambled everything on a single desperate chance. She asked him about Sarah. The question opened something Tom had kept carefully sealed since their escape. He told her about Michael, about the brother who had been his best friend and his opposite in almost every way. Michael had been the brave one, the one who ran toward danger while Tom analyzed it from a safe distance. Michael had enlisted right out of high school, certain that service meant something, that protecting others was worth any sacrifice. Tom had stayed home, had pursued his doctorate, had built a career studying the wars others fought, while he remained safely behind the walls of academia. He had always felt guilty about that, the comfortable distance between his brother's sacrifice and his own safe choices. Then Michael died, and Sarah became Tom's responsibility. She was 3 years old when they put her father in the ground. Too young to understand why Daddy wasn't coming home, old enough to feel the absence like a wound that never fully healed. Tom had promised Michael's memory that he would give Sarah every opportunity, every chance, every door that might open onto a better future than the one their conquered world seemed to offer. That promise had brought him here, to an alien palace where he mopped floors and stayed invisible, to conversations with a queen who ruled 1,000 worlds, to a small ship hurtling toward hostile space, while the girl he had sworn to protect remained in the hands of his enemies. The queen listened without interruption, her ancient eyes holding depths of understanding that surprised him. When he finished, she shared something of her own, the child she had lost centuries ago before the Empire had consumed her entirely. A daughter who had died in a plague that swept through the outer colonies, beyond the reach of Valorian medicine, beyond the power of even a queen to save. We carry our dead with us. Her voice was soft, almost human in its grief. They become part of who we are, shaping every choice, every action. Your brother lives in you, Thomas, in the promises you keep and the principles you refuse to abandon. The words settled into Tom's chest like stones, heavy and somehow comforting. He had never spoken to anyone about Michael like this, not even Sarah, who deserved to know her father through stories rather than silence. But here in the space between stars, with a being who had lived for centuries and lost more than Tom could imagine, the weight felt bearable. Draxus appeared on the sensors during the third day, a world of rust-red deserts and silver cities, beautiful in a stark way that reminded Tom of photographs he had seen of Mars before the Valorian terraforming projects transformed it into something unrecognizable. The planet hung in the viewport like a jewel wrapped in anger, surrounded by warships that moved to intercept the moment they detected the approaching vessel. The communication systems crackled with challenges and threats. Identify yourselves. State your purpose. Any hostile action will be met with immediate destruction. The voices carried the tension of beings prepared for war, expecting betrayal, trusting nothing that emerged from Valorian space. The Queen responded personally, her voice carrying across the void with a calm that seemed to still the chaos of the moment. She announced herself without title or ceremony, simply Aurelia, coming to speak with the leaders of Draxus, carrying no weapons, no guards, no fleet support. She asked only for the chance to listen. The silence that followed stretched for nearly an hour. Tom watched the warships holding position around them, weapons-locked crews undoubtedly debating whether to destroy the vessel immediately or allow this unprecedented situation to develop. He thought about the calculations being made on both sides of that decision, the risks of trusting a Valorian monarch, the risks of killing one. Finally, a single response came through. They would be escorted to the surface. They would be searched and secured upon arrival. Any resistance would result in immediate execution. The Queen accepted these terms without hesitation. The capital city of Draxus rose from the red desert like a monument to defiance. Silver spires reached toward a copper sky, their architecture deliberately different from the crystalline aesthetics of Valorian construction. Everything here spoke of independence, of identity, of a people who had maintained their sense of self despite 2 centuries of imperial absorption. They were taken to a building that had once served as the Valorian governor's mansion, a symbol of occupation now repurposed as the headquarters of the provisional government. Guards surrounded them at every step. Weapons that Tom did not recognize trained on their backs as they moved through corridors designed to intimidate. The council chamber where they were brought held none of the grandeur of its Valorian equivalent. Functional furniture, harsh lighting walls bare of decoration. 12 beings waited there, representatives of different regions and factions within the Draxus independence movement. Their bodies had a metallic sheen that caught the light differently than Valorian crystal, their movements carrying an efficiency that spoke of their trading heritage. At the head of the group stood Mira. She was smaller than the others, her metallic skin marked with patterns that Tom would later learn indicated 20 years of imprisonment in a Valorian detention facility. Her eyes held a particular hardness of someone who had survived things that should have killed her, who had emerged from darkness with hatred calcified into the core of her being. Her first words to the Queen carried no diplomatic courtesy. "Give me one reason I should not have you executed where you stand." The accusation that followed was a litany of grievances 2 centuries in the making. Exploitation, suppression, the systematic erasure of Drax's culture and identity, children taken from families to be educated in Valorian ways, resources extracted to feed an empire that gave nothing in return, a people reduced to administrators and logistics officers useful, but never respected, never equal. The Queen listened without defense or interruption. Her colors cycled through shades of acknowledgement that seemed to validate rather than excuse the accusations. When Mira finally paused, breathing hard with the effort of containing rage that had built for decades, Aurelia spoke a single sentence. "Everything you have said is true." The admission rippled through the council chamber like a shockwave. This was not what they had expected, not justification, not explanation, not the careful diplomatic language that obscured more than it revealed. The Queen of the Valorian Empire had just confirmed every grievance the Draxis independence movement had ever articulated. Mira's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And yet you come here expecting what? Forgiveness, reconciliation. Do you think an apology erases 200 years of suffering?" "I expect nothing." The Queen's voice remained steady. "I came to ask what you need. Not to tell you what I will give you, but to understand what would make you want to be part of something different. Something that does not yet exist, but might if we can find the courage to build it together." The negotiation that followed lasted through the night and into the next day. Tom participated when asked, offering historical parallels and examples of how other conquered peoples had found paths forward that preserved their dignity while maintaining beneficial connections to larger structures. He spoke of the European Union of federated systems that allowed member states to maintain their identities while cooperating on matters of mutual interest. But the breakthrough came not from history or political theory. It came from Mira herself during a moment when the talks had stalled over questions of representation and authority. She turned to Tom with eyes that seemed to see through every mask he had ever worn. "You are human. Your species was absorbed into this empire just as ours was. You have suffered under Valorian rule just as we have suffered. And yet you stand beside their queen advocating for a system that keeps you connected to your conquerors." Why Tom thought about the question longer than diplomatic protocol typically allowed. He thought about Sarah, about Echo, about the years of invisibility that had taught him things no classroom ever could. He thought about Michael, who had believed that service meant something even when the cause was imperfect. Because separation isn't freedom. It's just a different kind of isolation. My people were conquered, yes. We lost control of our own destiny, but we also gained access to things we never could have achieved alone: medicine that cures diseases we couldn't even diagnose, technology that lets my niece study among the stars, the chance to be part of something larger than one small planet spinning in the void. He met Mira's eyes without flinching. The empire that absorbed us was unjust, cruel, blind to anything that didn't serve its own interests. But that doesn't mean the idea of connection is wrong, only that this particular version of it was broken. We can build something better, something that keeps the benefits while fixing what was poisoned. Or we can tear everything apart and spend the next century fighting over the pieces. Mira studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke words that changed everything. "You claim to believe in equality. You claim your queen sees us as partners rather than subjects. But you brought a human with you, a member of a species the Valorians have treated as tools for 3 decades. If you truly believe what you say, prove it." Her next words fell like stones into still water. "Let us execute him. Let us kill this human as a symbol of our rejection of everything the Empire represents. If you refuse, you prove that even now, even here, a human life matters more to you than ours ever did. If you agree, perhaps I will believe that something has actually changed." The silence that followed was absolute. Tom felt his heart stop, restart, hammer against his ribs with the desperate rhythm of a trapped animal. He looked at the Queen, saw her colors cycling through horror and calculation and something that might have been grief. This was the test, the moment when abstract principles met concrete reality. The Queen could sacrifice him one life against billions of calculus that any rational being would accept. Or she could refuse and confirm every suspicion Mira harbored about Valorian hypocrisy. Tom made the decision before the Queen could speak. I volunteer. Every eye in the chamber turned to him. The Queen's colors flared with protest, but Tom continued before she could interrupt. If my death can prevent a war that would kill billions, then my death has meaning. That is what soldiers do. We give our lives so that others might live. I have been a soldier. I have carried wounded men through enemy fire. I have buried friends who died for causes they believed in. This is no different. He addressed Mira directly, holding her gaze with everything he had. I am not afraid to die for something that matters. But I am asking you to consider whether killing me actually serves your purpose. You want proof that things have changed. My death proves only that you have the power to kill a power you have always had. What would truly prove change is if you chose not to use that power. If you found the strength to build instead of destroy. Mira's expression remained frozen, but something shifted in her eyes. The hardness was still there, the decades of suffering and rage that had shaped her into the leader she had become. But beneath it, Tom saw something else stirring. Recognition, respect, the beginning of doubt about certainties that had sustained her through 20 years of imprisonment. In 200 years, no one from the Empire has ever been willing to die for us. Her voice was quieter now, stripped of the ceremonial fury that had marked her earlier accusations. They have killed for us. Killed millions of us when we resisted, killed thousands. When we submitted, killed hope itself with their endless extraction and exploitation. But none of them ever stood before us and offered their own life as proof of sincerity. She turned to the Queen. Who is this human? Why does he matter to you? Aurelia's answer came slowly, carefully weighted with meaning that extended beyond the immediate moment. He is a night guard, a janitor who cleaned floors in my palace for 3 years. He fed a creature that everyone else had forgotten. He answered questions honestly when I asked them. And he taught me things about leadership and connection that 4 centuries of ruling an empire never revealed. The Queen's colors settled into the silver blue that Tom had learned to associate with her truest self. He matters because everyone matters. Because the lowest and the highest are equally valuable in a civilization that deserves to survive. That is what he taught me. That is what I am trying to build. And if you cannot see that truth, then perhaps we have failed already. The council members exchanged glances, communicating in the silent language of beings who had spent years learning to read each other's intentions. Tom watched the calculation happening, the reassessment of everything they had believed about their enemies. Mira made her decision. We will talk, not as conquered and conqueror, but as equals seeking common ground. The human lives not because we lacked the power to kill him, but because killing him would make us what we claim to oppose. The negotiations resumed with a different energy. Trust had not been established that would take years of demonstrated commitment. But the possibility of trust had been opened, a door that had seemed permanently sealed, now cracked just enough to let light through. They worked through the night, hammering out the framework of what would become the Federation Treaty. Not an empire with subjects, but an alliance of equals. Draxus and Corvin would have complete autonomy over internal affairs. They would have equal representation in a reformed Galactic Council. They would keep their resources and trade networks while remaining part of a larger structure for mutual defense and coordinated development. The treaty acknowledged past wrongs explicitly. The Queen, on behalf of the Valorian people, formally apologized for 2 centuries of exploitation and cultural suppression. It was just words. Words could not resurrect the dead or heal the wounded, but words mattered. They established a foundation on which something better might eventually be built. Dawn was breaking over the red deserts of Draxus when the final provisions were agreed. Tom stood by a window, watching the copper sky lighten, feeling the weight of exhaustion, and something that might have been hope pressing equally against his chest. Then the communications systems activated with an emergency broadcast from the Valorian capital. Admiral Kale's face filled the screen, his scarred, crystalline features arranged in an expression of cold satisfaction. The message was simple and devastating. The Regency government acknowledges receipt of the proposed treaty. Terms are rejected. Fleet deployment to Sector Draxus will commence within 48 hours. Additionally, the human Thomas Hartley is informed that his niece Sarah Hartley remains in protective custody. Her continued survival is contingent upon his immediate return to face justice for crimes against the Empire. The transmission ended. Tom stared at the blank screen, feeling something break inside him that he had not known was still intact. Sarah, his brother's daughter, the girl he had promised to protect, the reason he had taken a job mopping floors in an alien palace, the last piece of Michael still walking in the world. She was in Kale's hands, and the Admiral was offering a trade, Tom's life for hers. The Queen's hand touched his shoulder, her crystalline fingers surprisingly gentle. We will find a way. The treaty can still work. Draxus and Corvin will broadcast their support publicly, and Kale will lose legitimacy if he attacks after peace has been offered. Tom heard the words but could not process them. His mind was already elsewhere, calculating distances and timelines, measuring the gap between where he stood and where Sarah waited. I have to go back. The Queen's colors flickered with distress. If you return, he will kill you. And Sarah, he has no intention of honoring any agreement. Tom knew she was right. Kale's message was not a negotiation. It was a trap designed to draw him back into the Admiral's power. Going back meant death for both of them, not just him. But staying meant abandoning Sarah to whatever fate Kale had planned. It meant breaking the promise he had made to Michael, the promise that had defined his life for 21 years. The choice was impossible. Every path led to loss. Mira approached, her metallic features softened by something that might have been understanding. The human is torn between duty and love, between the billions this treaty might save and the one life he cannot bear to sacrifice. Her eyes met Tom's, carrying depths of experience that only someone who had faced similar choices could possess. I spent 20 years in a Valorian prison because I refused to betray my people. I watched friends die. I lost everything I had ever loved. And I learned something in that darkness that I will share with you now. She paused, gathering words that seemed to cost her something to speak. You cannot save everyone. That is the cruelest truth of leadership. Sometimes you must choose between terrible options, knowing that any choice you make will cause suffering. The question is not how to avoid pain. Pain is inevitable. The question is what kind of pain you can live with. Tom closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle into his bones. I promised my brother I would protect her. He died believing I would keep that promise. And if you die trying to keep it, who protects her then? The question cut through his spiral of guilt and obligation. Mira was right. Racing back to confront Kyle would not save Sarah. It would only give the Admiral 2 victims instead of 1. But doing nothing was equally impossible. The solution emerged from the space between desperation and calculation. The treaty had been signed. Draxus and Corvin were prepared to announce their support publicly. If that announcement came with enough force, if the newly allied sectors demonstrated that they stood with the Queen against Kale's regency, the Admiral's position would become untenable. They worked through the details with frantic precision. Draxus would broadcast support for the Federation Treaty across every channel, every frequency, every corner of the galaxy where Valorian communications could reach. Corvin would do the same. The message would be clear. Peace had been achieved, and any attack on the newly federated sectors would be an act of aggression against a legitimate alliance, not a suppression of rebellion. Kale would be forced to choose. He could proceed with his attack and become a war criminal in the eyes of half the galaxy. Or he could accept the treaty and lose the justification for his regency. Either way, his leverage over Sarah would diminish. The broadcast went out as the sun rose fully over Draxus. Tom listened to Mira's voice carrying across the void, announcing that a new era had begun, that former enemies had found common ground, that the dream of a galaxy united by choice rather than force was finally within reach. Then they returned to the Valorian capital. The palace was chaos when they arrived. Kale's regency had collapsed in the hours since the broadcast began. Moderate council members withdrawing their support as public opinion shifted dramatically against military action. The Admiral had retreated to his private quarters with a contingent of loyal guards, Sarah among his hostages. Tom moved through corridors he had cleaned 1,000 times, but now he moved with purpose rather than invisibility. Guards who had once looked through him now stepped aside, recognizing something in he bearing that commanded respect. He found Echo first. The creature was alive barely. Chained in a medical facility, wounds from the escape still healing, amber eyes dull with pain and sedation. But when Tom entered, those eyes brightened. Echo made a sound that was part whimper, part greeting, the voice of a being who had given everything and somehow survived. Tom knelt beside his friend, pressing his forehead against Echo's damaged form. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I left you." Echo's response was a low rumble, a vibration that passed through Tom's body like forgiveness made physical. The creature had no words, but it did not need them. Some things transcended language. Tom freed Echo from the medical restraints supporting the creature's weakened body as they made their way toward Kale's quarters. The being who had saved his life would be beside him for whatever came next. The Admiral's door was guarded by 6 soldiers, their crystalline bodies arranged in defensive formation. Tom approached alone, Echo hanging back in the shadows, every step carrying him closer to a confrontation he had spent 3 years trying to avoid. "Let me through. I'm here to negotiate for the hostage." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Their orders had been clear, but those orders came from a regent whose authority was crumbling by the minute. The broadcast from Draxus had changed everything. The admiral they served was rapidly becoming a liability rather than a leader. One guard stepped aside, then another. The formation dissolved as each soldier made the calculation that loyalty to Kyle was no longer worth the cost. Tom entered alone. The admiral's quarters were smaller than Tom had expected, functional rather than luxurious. Kale stood by a window overlooking the city he had tried to rule, his scarred crystalline body rigid with the tension of a being watching everything he had built collapse. Sarah sat in a chair nearby, her wrists bound with energy restraints, her face pale but defiant. When she saw Tom, her eyes filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. "Uncle Tom, you shouldn't have come." Tom ignored her words, focusing on the admiral. "It's over, KL. The treaty is signed. Draxus and Corvin have announced their support. The council is abandoning you. There is nothing left to fight for." Kale turned slowly, his colors cycling through shades of rage and despair. "You think this is victory? You think your precious federation will last? It will collapse within a decade, torn apart by the very freedoms you've given them. And when it does, remember that I tried to prevent it. Remember that I knew what weakness would cost." His hand moved to a weapon at his side. "But you will not live to see that failure, neither of you." Tom did not flinch, did not retreat, did not show the terror that hammered against his ribs. "You can kill us. You have the power, but it will not bring your son back. It will not erase the pain that has driven you for 83 years. All it will do is create more orphans, more grieving families, more beings who carry their dead the way you have carried Veleth." Kale's hand trembled on the weapon. "Do not speak his name. I will speak it because someone should." Veleth believed in understanding. He died for that belief, and his death broke something in you that never healed. But he would not want this. He would not want his memory to justify atrocities. He would want his father to find another way. The weapon rose, pointed directly at Tom's chest. "You know nothing of what he would want. I know he convinced a queen to try negotiation instead of war. I know he argued for mercy when everyone around him demanded blood. I know he was the kind of being who believed that enemies could become allies if someone was brave enough to try." Tom took a step forward into the weapon's range. Be the father he believed in. Honor his memory by choosing differently. The moment stretched into eternity. Tom watched Kale's finger tighten on the trigger, watched the colors cycle through the admiral's crystalline body. Rage, grief, exhaustion, and something else. Something that might have been recognition. Then Kale's eyes moved to Sarah. To the young woman bound in the chair, watching the confrontation with terrified defiance. A girl barely older than Veleth had been when he died. The weapon lowered. "I have created enough orphans." The words emerged like a confession dragged from somewhere deep beneath the armor of decades. Kael's colors faded to gray. Not defeat, but surrender of a different kind. The surrender of a being who had finally found the limit of what vengeance could demand. Tom moved to Sarah, releasing her restraints with fingers that trembled, despite his best efforts to hold them steady. She fell into his arms sobbing, and he held her the way he had held her when she was 3 years old, when the world had taken her father and left her with only an uncle who did not know how to fill that void. The council vote came 3 days later. The Federation Treaty was presented formally with representatives from Draxus and Corvin attending via holographic link. The debate was fierce, but ultimately one-sided public opinion had shifted too dramatically for the traditionalists to hold their ground. When the final vote was called, Tom watched from the observer gallery with Sarah beside him and Echo at his feet. The creature had healed faster than anyone expected, its biosynthetic body responding to care and attention after decades of neglect. The votes fell one by one. Yes, 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 the treaty would pass, that much had become certain hours ago. But the final vote held unexpected significance. Admiral Kyle rose from his seat, his scarred form commanding attention despite everything that had happened. The chamber fell silent, waiting to hear what the being who had nearly destroyed everything would say. "I vote in favor of the treaty." The words sent shockwaves through the assembly. Kyle continued, his voice steady despite the colors of grief that flickered across his crystalline body. "My son died believing that understanding could bridge the gaps between peoples. For 83 years, I allowed his death to convince me that he was wrong. I allowed pain to make me into something he would not have recognized. But I will not allow his memory to be used as justification for atrocities he would have opposed." The Admiral's eyes found Tom in the gallery. "A human taught me what my own son could not. Sometimes the bravest thing is not to fight. Sometimes the strongest thing is to heal." The treaty passed unanimously. 6 months later, Tom walked the corridors of the palace that had been his workplace for over 3 years. The familiar route, the familiar rhythm, the familiar weight of the cleaning cart beside him. Everything was the same, and everything was different. The Federation was functioning. Not perfectly, there were disputes and disagreements and the inevitable friction of beings learning to cooperate after centuries of conflict. But it was working. Draxus and Corvin had become genuine partners in the new structure, their representatives participating in council sessions as equals rather than subjects. The Queen had offered Tom a position, citizen's advisor, a new council seat representing those traditionally excluded from power. The invitation had come with genuine respect, an acknowledgement of everything he had contributed to the transformation that was reshaping galactic civilization. He had declined. A queen who needed a janitor to teach her about leadership did not need that janitor sitting on her council. She needed him exactly where he had always been, moving through the shadows, listening, watching, offering truth when truth was asked for, and disappearing back into the background when it was not. Some people were meant to sit on thrones, others were meant to clean the floors around them. Both roles had value. Both contributed to the functioning of the whole. Echo padded beside him now. The creature's wounds fully healed, its amber eyes carrying a contentment that had replaced the desperate loneliness of 3 years ago. The bond between them had only deepened through everything they had endured, a human and a biosynthetic predator connected by something that transcended programming and species. Tom paused at the entrance to the Grand Council chamber, watching the morning light stream through the massive windows. Inside, representatives from a dozen worlds were preparing for a session that would address trade agreements and resource sharing, mundane matters that would have been decided by imperial decree a year ago, now subject to genuine deliberation among equals. As he turned to continue his route, the chamber doors opened. Queen Aurelia emerged, surrounded by advisors and delegates from 3 federated worlds. The corridor fell silent. Protocol demanded that lesser beings clear the path for royalty. Tom stepped aside as he had done 1,000 times before, but this time Aurelia stopped. Her silver blue light turned toward him, and in full view of every delegate, every guard, every being who had gathered to witness the morning's proceedings, she inclined her head. A small gesture. A queen acknowledging a janitor. The advisors exchanged confused glances, uncertain how to interpret what they had just witnessed. Tom nodded back, then resumed pushing his cart toward the eastern corridor. Behind him, whispers spread through the crowd. They would wonder. They would speculate. They would never fully understand what had passed between their sovereign and the human who cleaned her floors. But they had seen it, and that was enough. Sarah called that evening, her face filling his communication screen with excitement that made her look younger than her 24 years. She had been accepted into the Interstellar Medical Initiative, a new program that would train physicians to serve across federated space. The first human admitted to a program that had once been restricted to Valorian citizens exclusively. Tom listened to her dreams pour out in a rush of words and plans and possibilities. He thought about Michael, about the promise made over a grave, about the 21 years of sacrifice and invisibility that had led to this moment. His brother's daughter was building a future among the stars. The night settled over Manhattan. Tom walked home with Echo beside him, a shadow made loyal by nothing more complicated than kindness. Tomorrow there would be more floors to clean, more chances to listen, more moments when truth might matter to someone who needed to hear it. That was enough. That had always been enough.